these lines that she's laying on him about like, oh, what would happen if you kissed like this in a church? What about like this? If a woman were doing that to me, I'd be like, listen, I know what you're trying to do. We can just fuck.
Yeah.
We don't have to,
like
we
I'm
don't have to
sold.
do this conversation anymore. Yeah, I'm sold. Like, you just here. Alternatively, just take your clothes off.
Remember when we first met John McClane? Argyle picked him up from the plane and took him down the Nakatomi Tower at the Christmas party. And the terrorists were overzealous, but it was sweet when they killed Ellis. And with a little help from Alan, John McClane kicked ass.
Welcome back to Shat The Movies, the podcast where we answer the question, were the movies we loved when we were growing up really that good? Have you ever caught yourself thinking, why don't they make movies like they used to? Can you still remember spending your Friday night searching for the perfect movie rental at Blockbuster Video? Do you know what Blockbuster Video is? If you answered yes, this is the podcast for you. I am one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my co-hosts, Ash Duckface Banks.
Hi, y'all.
And coming to us live from across the pond, it's Rob Will Taylor.
Hi there.
Each week, we take a look back in time and decide if our favorite films still hold up. The movies we cover are chosen by you, the listeners, who generously commission the films you love. If you'd like to see all the movies we have covered, will cover, want to choose one for yourself, please visit shatpod.com and have a look. At the end of each podcast, we'll provide you, the audience, with the number of wipes each movie would take to get off your respective butts. So thank you so much for listening. If you have not already, hit that subscribe button and share with a friend. It's how we help the podcast grow. Additionally, subscribe to our sister podcast, Shat on TV, where we review TV series such as Westworld, Taboo, American Gods, Game of Thrones, True Detective, Lovecraft Country, and Watchmen. Find all our information and past episodes at shatpod.com/TV. And for those who have asked, we're very flattered that you're asking about our True Detective coverage. We're not covering it this season, but everybody should watch it. It looks like it's going to be fantastic. The King Bee and I are going to be having our own private watch parties in person, old school, and I'm sure we'll drop some opinions on it on Shat Discord and through social media. Finally, if you'd like to hang out with us live, follow and subscribe to our Twitch channel, shatpod.com/Twitch, and our YouTube channel where we play video games, host watch parties, and edit this podcast live. And again, this week, we've got a commission from Joe, who did Escape to Victory and Hawk the Slayer, this time with something a little bit different, and we'll let him speak to it himself.
Hello, Big D, Gene, and particularly Ash. Self-appointed British correspondent Joe T here once again. I want to start by addressing the Shat scores for Hawk the Slayer, which was my commission last week. I imagine that many of the listeners, and perhaps you guys, thought I was deliberately getting you to watch the worst possible film imaginable. I would like to reiterate this is not the case. If I wanted to do that, I would have commissioned Bolero, or Star Crash, or Thundercrack. In fact, I might commission all of them at some stage. But anyway, instead I chose Hawk the Slayer because of the links with my grandma, but also because of how it fits with my commission for this week, 4 Weddings and a Funeral. You may be wondering what on earth I'm talking about, but you see, Hawk the Slayer and 4 Weddings and a Funeral are actually two sides of the same cinematic coin. They're both brave British attempts to make a film in a particular genre, but for a lot less money. For Hawk the Slayer, it was sword and sorcery fantasy, and I think we can all agree it was a failure. I would argue an admirable failure, but a failure nonetheless. For 4 Weddings and a Funeral, the best that Britain had to offer took on the romantic comedy genre and, if you ask me, absolutely knocked it out of the park. In the 1980s, films like Chariots of Fire and A Room with a View showed you Americans that the Brits could deliver when it came to historical dramas, but these were essentially art house movies on your side of the pond. 4 Weddings and a Funeral was different. The film actually opened in the US first. It had a limited release in the US in March 1994, followed by a wider US release in April, but the UK premiere was not until May, with a national release soon after that. By the time it finally reached our shores, it had already attracted a lot of buzz off the back of very positive reviews and was the highest grossing British film ever in America at that time. Then Liz Hurley turned up at the premiere in London wearing that dress. The song from the film Love Is All Around stayed at the top of the charts in the UK for 15 weeks, and the rest is history. I love this film. As far as I'm concerned, it has everything you want. It has a fantastic script from Sigmund Freud's great-grandson-in-law, Richard Curtis, who us Brits already adored thanks to shows like Blackadder. It has an amazing cast, nearly all of whom were largely unknown at the time, except Rowan Atkinson, who us Brits already adored thanks to TV shows like Blackadder. And it also has moments that are extremely sad, which is exactly what you want from any British comedy. Great sadness and plenty of crying. From a British perspective, the film is basically a fairy tale about our class system, and one that is about as accurate at representing the lives of upper-class university graduates as Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels is about working-class gangsters. But within that fantasy, there's a lot that actually rings very true about the way we do weddings. For those who don't know, the UK has many weird rules about what you can and can't do at weddings. Want to have your wedding outside? That's a no. Want to mention God at any point? Not allowed, unless you're inside a very specific religious building. Want to give women speeches? Not strictly against the rules, but definitely still frowned upon. All this results in people having to go to essentially the same event dozens and dozens of times. One summer, I went to 3 weddings in 8 days, and they were all the same. Everyone dressed as they do in 4 weddings, and 2 of the 3 ceremonies even had the same reading from the first wedding in the film. And yes, there's often a painfully bad musical performance. I must have watched this film 40 or 50 times, including the night before I was best man at a friend's wedding, on 2 separate occasions. The Boatman pub, where Hugh Grant and Andie MacDowell first engaged in sexual congress, is actually the King's Arms pub, 5 minutes down the road from where my grandma lives. And although the first time I saw it was not with her, I'm pretty sure the second time I saw it was. Some have suggested the amount of bad language could make it an unsuitable film to watch with your grandma. But believe me, you do not know unsuitable until you've sat down with your grandma to watch Y Tu Mama Tambien. Finally, I concede that certain aspects do seem a little strange nowadays. Nobody seems to have a job, and it's all very well, for example, saying that you don't want to get married, but Carrie would not be able to stay in the UK without a spousal visa. Plus, nowadays, the complete absence of non-white actors does seem strange, but a total lack of people of colour is probably pretty accurate for those types of weddings in Britain at the time. And there is, of course, a deaf character played by a deaf actor, and a gay couple, at least one of whom is played by a real-life gay man, so how's that for diversity? I hope this will go some way for making amends for last week, and you will accept my Bolero, Star Crush and Thundercrack commissions for next year. Is it still raining? I hadn't noticed. Cheerio.
4 Weddings and a Funeral is a 1994 British romantic comedy, the first of several films by screenwriter Richard Curtis to star Hugh Grant. The story follows the adventures of Charles, played by Hugh Grant, and his circle of friends through a number of social occasions as they each encounter romance. Andie MacDowell co-stars as Charles' love interest Carrie, with Kristen Scott Thomas, James Fleet, Simon Callow, John Hannah, Charlotte Coleman, David Bower, Corin Redgrave, and Rowan Atkinson in supporting roles. The film was made in 6 weeks, cost under £3 million, and became the highest-grossing British film in history at the time, with a worldwide box office total of $245.7 million. 4 Weddings and a Funeral earned Academy Award nominations for Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay, while Hugh Grant won the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy, and the BAFTA Award for Best Actor in a Leading Role. The film won additional BAFTA awards for Best Film, Best Direction, and Best Actress in a Supporting Role for Scott Thomas. In 1999, 4 Weddings and a Funeral was placed 23rd on the British Film Institute's 100 Greatest British Films of the 20th Century, and in 2016, Empire magazine ranked it 21st in their list of the 100 Best British Films. A 2017 poll of 150 actors, directors, writers, producers, and critics for Time Out magazine ranked 4 Weddings and a Funeral the 74th best British film ever. The director and surviving cast reunited for a 25th anniversary reunion comic relief short entitled One Red Nose Day and a Wedding, which aired in the UK during Red Nose Day on the 15th of March, 2019. So Rob, Ash, we always ask what your memories are of the movie we're covering. Rob, since you are our guest and English expert, we'll start with you.
Well, I just left school the previous summer in 1993. That January, I'd started working full time, and my days off would be go and rent a stack of videos from Blockbuster to sit and watch them. This was a film that was everywhere in the UK in 1994. You couldn't get away from it, and it was almost an obligation. You had to watch it. It really kickstarted a big film renaissance for British film, along with Shallow Grave.
Yeah, I mean, I saw this for the first time. I think I was like 12, maybe 13 years old. And I've shared before, like, as weirdly religious as my family was, I saw a lot of R-rated stuff I should have never seen when I saw it. Like, now that I have kids, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that was a choice that I got, exposed to that super early. And that really centers around a lot of like R-rated comedies of the 90s. And this is one of them because I thought it was really cool that I got to see it early. And lots of people, were saying fuck, which I thought was like, a neat thing when I was 12 years old. I instantly loved it and have since then. I think this is a really, really funny movie. I love British humor. I especially love like a good dry British humor or awkward British humor, and this has both. And this movie was an entry point for me into a lot of Brit cinema, which I had not seen before. And I know that as an American of my age, like I'm not alone in that. This kind of was a gateway drug in a way into certain Brit comedies. And I think that we have to realize the importance of this movie from the outset, that like a small film like this happening, it happened so that movies like Trainspotting and like the eventually like absolutely delightful Full Monty, like those movies would have never happened if it had not been for the success of this one. So not only do I love it, I'm super grateful for it. And I was really excited, Joe, to revisit it. So thank you so much for commissioning.
I didn't really get into, I think, British film until maybe 1998, right around when Lock, Stock and a lot of other movies were coming out, much like you. And then, of course, graduated to Trainspotting. And it should be no surprise that with a lot of those films, I get them mixed up. Once again, it's something I do on this pod all the time. I saw Hugh Grant and thought Four Weddings and a Funeral was Love Actually, which in my defense also has a wedding and an insufferably pretty white girl who doesn't deserve the man who's fawning over her. Plus the trog. So I mean, like it's these movies blended together for me. So I forgot that I didn't realize that I hadn't seen this, and I was delighted when I did because it had a version of Hugh Grant that I was not familiar with. That was not the Hugh Grant from Notting Hill, and I enjoyed it a lot. Let's hit the trailer.
There are one or two things you need for a successful wedding. Tact.
So, John, how's that gorgeous girlfriend of yours?
She's no longer my girlfriend.
Ah, dear. Still, I wouldn't get too gloomy about it. Rumour has it she never stopped bonking old Toby Delisle just in case you didn't work out.
She is now my wife.
A discreet best man.
When Bernard told me he was getting engaged to Lydia, I congratulated him because all his other girlfriends had been such complete dogs. Although, may I say how delighted we are to have so many of them here this evening.
Delightful guests.
How'd you do? My name's Charles.
Don't be ridiculous. Charles died 20 years ago.
Must be a different Charles, I think.
Are you telling me I don't know my own brother?
No.
An experienced vicar.
Who lives and reigns with you and the holy goat. Ghost.
And a loving bride.
I do.
A film with a message. Don't get married. Unless you fall recklessly in love.
I feel it in my finger. I feel it in my toe.
What do you think?
Divine.
Love is all around me, and so the feeling grows.
Hugh Grant and Andie MacDowell invite you to Four Weddings and a Funeral from the creators of Enchanted April and Blackadder.
May Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
At the wedding of Angus and Laura in Somerset, the best man, Charles, his flatmate Scarlett, his friend Fiona and her brother Tom, Gareth and his partner Matthew, and Charles's deaf brother David endure the festivities. At the reception, Charles is attracted to Carrie, a young American. They have sex, and in the morning, Carrie, who is returning to the U.S., laments that they may have missed a great opportunity.
The first wedding really sums up the reality of a British wedding today, much less 30 years ago. It's at a posh venue miles away, so it means a really long drive. Now, we're not as comfortable with long drives as you are in America, so it takes quite a lot of doing to drive, sort of 2 or 3 hours. We have to find somewhere to stay that isn't at the venue because, of course, the prices are extortionate. It means bumping into people that you don't really like, but you have to pretend to because they're related to the bride or the groom, and you probably do blurt out something that you probably shouldn't have blurted out because you've had a few beers and didn't really like them anyway. Yeah, if you're lucky enough that you've got a group around you, then you're actually trying to raid as many free drinks as you can as a group before it goes to the paid bar, because again, the extortionate prices kick in. You're sticking together as much as you can to avoid all those awful relations that you don't really want to spend your time with. It's like Aunt Mildred or Uncle Fester or whatever, just you don't want to deal with them. I can remember one wedding where I was actually the best man and I was actually ready to walk off and sack the whole thing because the way the mother-in-law was speaking to me, she was more of a bridezilla than the bride. She was treating me like I was a gopher, literally just fetch and carry. And I had to say to her that, I'm not there for you. I'm not there for the bride. I'm there for the groom. My job's just to make sure he gets there and doesn't change his mind. And literally, the way you're behaving at the moment, I could see why you would. Yeah, it really is responsible, I think, this film, for what we have. Because the thing to bear in mind, this is an upper class wedding, a regular wedding, but it set that aspiration for everybody to have that upper class or bigger class wedding. So now we have the boutique wedding where everybody has to go to a stately home or a upper class venue or higher class of church than they normally would have done. And everybody wants it. Nobody can just have a simple ceremony anymore because of this film.
Rob, in defense of the Aunt Mildreds in the world, like, I'm hitting that stage. I'm 43 now. And when I go to weddings and I see the children, I do that thing that always weirded me out when I was a kid where I'm like, oh my God, you got so big. I remember when you were this big. You make a motion right around your knee level. But I have a dumb American question for you though, Rob. So Hugh Grant mentions staying at the pub called the Lucky Boatman. And I lived in the UK for a summer. I went to many a pub. I drank pretty much all over London and parts unknown. I never realized you could stay at the pub. Is that normal?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a thing where you can necessarily just, if you're drinking in a pub, just go upstairs and stay, unless you know the landlord or somebody who's already living above it well, and they'll let you crash. But generally, pubs are traditionally inns, first and foremost. So many pubs will let you book rooms if they have them. You can still stay above in a pub. Just last week, I stayed in probably what would be the equivalent to a Holiday Inn, but that's then linked to an actual pub, like restaurant.
It's funny because I think of that as exotic, but then I think about it, I'm like, wait, we have every hotel in America has got a bar, but I never drink at that bar because they don't call it a pub. What they ought to do is say, hey, we've got a pub with a hotel attached. I'm like, fucking awesome. But hotel bar, no thanks.
I think you're hitting on something that's such a cultural difference, though, right? Is because, Gene, the reason we don't do this here is because the bars here are not nearly as nice a lot of the time as like a really good pub, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like, who wants to stay above most of the bars that we attend here in the States? And also there's this like delineation that like drinking is an adult thing. We don't expose children to drinking because then they will all become alcoholics and live under bridges. When really, when we don't expose them to drinking, that's how they do end up under bridges. And I have a picture when I went to Paris for the first time when I moved there. I have a picture when I got off of the metro that I sent my family where there's like this like huge, sex shop. And then right next door is a McDonald's place. And so you've got like women in the windows that are half naked. And then you've got kids playing, and like that is Europe. And I think there's such a nice thing where we like, meld adult activities and introduce children to them, like, easily. And weddings are a big part of that, right? Like one thing you're not seeing a lot of in this movie are kids at these weddings. And I think that's another big thing that the States has done. Like I got so much hell when I got married that our wedding was children free because people were really offended they couldn't bring their kids. But like the type of weddings that we do here where they are like these all day affairs or these all night affairs, that can be really, really difficult on kids. And to your point as well, Rob, about the standing in weddings, I've stood in 3 weddings. One was fine, although when I got there, they hadn't had their flowers or anything everything. So I wound up doing the flowers for the whole wedding, which was annoying, but whatever. The second one was awful because it cost so much money. I mean, it was like $4,000 by the time all was said and done with me standing in that wedding. And then the third, I actually lost a complete friendship over because she asked me to be in her wedding. She knew I was pregnant. I was going to be 9 months pregnant when I stood in the wedding. She said she understood that that meant I may not show up. I had Ellie and then was diagnosed with postpartum preeclampsia. And so I was hospitalized. And so I couldn't, I literally was in the hospital. I couldn't drive to New Orleans. And to this day, she hasn't spoken to me because I didn't stand at her wedding.
Wow.
I don't want to speak for all the men in this podcast, Ash, but can you enlighten us as to what postpartum preeclampsia is?
Absolutely. So preeclampsia is a really scary thing that pregnant women get. It's why when I had Finn, I almost died because my blood pressure was 210 over 118 and I went blind and then had to have him because I almost it's what killed Sybil in Downton Abbey, if you're a Downton Abbey fan. And so a lot of times people who have preeclampsia in one pregnancy, they'll be fine during their pregnancy, but then they develop, it isn't actually preeclampsia because you have to be pregnant to have that, but you develop these massive blood pressure issues after you have the baby where your blood pressure goes just absolutely insane. So you can't move. They put you in a bed and you can't move and they put you on this IV drip. And so I literally was in a hospital bed and couldn't travel, but hey, it's fine.
I'm glad I asked. So Ash, you answered my question. I got to answer yours. I've stood in three weddings. And I don't know if it speaks to people's faith in me as a responsible adult or just the fact that the nature of the weddings that I was in, it was a breeze. I did nothing. I wore a tuxedo and I drank. It was great.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely did a lot of that too. And like I said, the first one was delightful. I wound up doing the flowers, but it was a delightful experience. She's lovely. He's lovely. They're wonderful. The second, also lovely people, but just very, very high maintenance. And I think that's the problem is I am not high maintenance at all. And so when people are and they want specific shoes and they want the specific $400 barrette that we're all going to put in our hairs, no. That's, I'm just not into it. So yeah, I drank a lot and had fun at the weddings and looked good in their pictures. You're welcome. And it was fine. But it was a lot of fucking money. And I think that's why I relate so much, though, to the beginning of this movie, which y'all objectively is fucking hilarious when Hugh Grant wakes up late like that. And he wakes up, Scarlett, his sister, and they're running through because the two of them are really taking this seriously. They know how big of a fucking deal this is that they're so late. And while Hugh Grant is great, Charlotte Coleman is so funny when she's getting ready and they're standing there and he's trying to zip her dress up. I mean, she's objectively a very quiet funny throughout the entire movie and very, very consistent. And I loved her. I'd never seen her in anything before this.
Yeah, for me, she's the real star of the film. Very underrated. I first saw the film because she was a child actress who actually starred in Wurzel Gummidge, which was a show that I used to watch when I was very, very young. And that had Doctor Who, the third Doctor, John Pertwee, in it. Then Marmalade Atkins, which was a rebellious teenager kind of show. So she'd been kind of around in the 80s. And this was her, almost like a breakthrough film and it was really seemed that she was going to go on the same sort of trajectory as the others who, they all really broke out and started to do big movies. Yeah, sadly, not even 7 years after the film came out, she passed away from an asthma attack. So it was really sad to, kind of hear, I think really all it needed, just like with John Hannah and something like The Mummy, it only would have needed the right role.
I often try to remind myself that the English aren't that exotic, that they're very much like us, that it's not this fantasy land. And then you tell me things like there's a show called Wurzel Gummidge and a character named Marmalade Atkins, and it doesn't really reinforce that lesson. Rob, the cast is outstanding, but I had a problem with one person in it who happened to not be English, and that was Andie MacDowell. So I feel like I'm becoming the guy on the podcast that picks apart the female talent, but I am, I guess. Her smile, it's terrible. She's got huge gums. Her teeth are sort of gray, and it's just, no, she smiles a lot. And she doesn't need to. Every time she smiled in this movie, I was like, you could just stop doing that because she would be better with her mouth closed. beyond that, I started to notice that she was struggling to talk. Like almost like her mouth wasn't lined up with the dialogue. And I thought, oh my God, is she not American? Is she like a European trying to do an American accent? No, she's from South Carolina. And I wondered, maybe what's happening here is that we're watching so many English people speak to each other that then the American sounds weird when they show up. Rob, is this what we sound like to you?
No. I think it's her. I think it's her. I mean, she's not the best actress.
No.
I also wouldn't be shocked because the film before this was Groundhog Day. So I wouldn't be shocked if she'd had some trauma coming off working with Bill Murray, to be fair. But I get the sense she was cheap. But not in that sense. But yeah.
Right.
I mean, sleeping with Hugh Grant on the first date.
I mean, wouldn't we all though, Rob? I mean, really.
Yeah, kind of.
Well, I wasn't going to say that, but...
I mean, I will.
But then again, Hugh would sleep with Divine Brown on the first date. So there we go.
I don't understand that reference. Who's Divine Brown?
Divine Brown was the sex worker that he picked up in L.A. Yeah.
Oh, I completely blocked that entire Hugh Grant pop culture moment.
That's because you didn't go on the TMZ tour with me.
You're right. I didn't. Yeah. And look at how I've suffered.
That's what my best man did with me. He took me on the TMZ tour of LA.
God.
While we were tuxedo shopping. It was fantastic.
She fit the budget, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Divine Brown or Andie MacDowell?
Both.
Probably both.
Oh, okay.
It's my biggest complaint with the whole thing. She's just, she's just really American. And I know, I get it, guys. I'm American. But I'm also completely uninteresting compared to a lot of Europeans that I know. I think there's this banality that comes with some of the conversations that I try to have. And more so than that, I didn't get the attraction. Now, beyond her black hat, when she walks into that wedding in that black hat, that hat is a sexy hat. I was there for it. But the rest of her, meh. And I'll say this, sure. Weddings are great for those that are getting married. They're probably great for those that are direct family. They're happy occasions usually, but they can also be really painful to attend and get through as a guest if it is a certain type of wedding. And what I love about this movie is that we immediately get that with the first wedding. The audience has to sit through a reading that really only means something to the couple. Then they sit through a really terrible musical number that's probably only chosen directly for that couple. And don't get me wrong. Okay, the wedding should be about the two people getting married, obviously. But there's a line where if it's too much like them, it alienates everybody else and maybe they should just get married by themselves, go elope and do something like that. And I think that's why attending with friends or with a partner, that's so necessary to really enjoy a wedding. And we get that with both the wedding and the after scenes. The friendship group that Hugh Grant and all of them are a part of, it's full of misfits, but they're misfits in a way that makes sense once they're all together. It makes complete sense why this group of people are friends. It's clear that they love one another. I love their reactions to this very relatable experience of attending these different types of weddings that are all awful in some weird way. We understand them immediately. We get who they are, but it's not cookie cutter. It's not so cliche where it's oh, she's the this person and she's the Joey and he's the Chandler, right? It isn't like that. They're filling roles that just naturally friendship groups find themselves with. And I automatically loved every single one of these people.
Ash, you mentioned the problem with weddings. I'm a big wedding lover. I love learning about the couple. I love ceremony. I love families and formal wear. I love free food and booze and dancing. And something happened in this movie that made my jaw drop. I was horrified to see guests leaving the wedding marquee. It's something I learned about today. Before the wedding was over. Every wedding I've ever attended, I was there until the house lights came on. The hotel staff or whatever had to ask me to leave the ballroom. And it is not uncommon for Persians to beg or bribe the venue to stay open so we can keep partying. I don't understand this leaving the wedding early thing. Is that normal?
Yeah, it is. In England, yeah. Normally it's because people are not always attending out of they 100% love the people. It's again, an obligation to attend. Also, we're not as comfortable with, say, long drives at night. So if we traveled quite a distance, say Somerset. So that's right in the southeast of the country. So that's 2 or 3 hours to London, potentially. If you're coming from anywhere northern, that's anything up to, maybe 4 or 5. That's assuming there's no traffic or roadworks.
Yeah, I was confused because it seemed like they were leaving the reception to go to a party at, quote unquote, the castle. And I was like, well, why would you leave the party with the free booze and the band just to go somewhere else? But it seems not uncommon. The other part that confused me was how early the wedding started, because Sarah and I married in September and our wedding started at 5 p.m. And with the 5 p.m. start, that gave us enough time to wake up, do hair and makeup, do the first look, do the family photos, and get to the venue maybe a half hour before the guests arrived. And had we done it any earlier, we would have had to wake up at like 5 a.m. And even with us doing it 5 p.m., some guests missed the wedding because of travel complications or bad timing. They missed flights or they didn't give themselves enough time to drive there. I was very confused by this as well, because in 4 weddings, Charles and Scarlett, the first thing we see, as Ash mentioned, they're waking up, they've overslept, they're rushing to get ready. And I'm like, dude, it's morning. Why? Like, what's the rush? Is it because we don't know it's a wedding at first, right? It's like, is it a job interview? Like, what is it that they're missing? And it looks like the wedding starts at like 11 a.m. Like, it looks like it's a morning time wedding. And I don't understand why they're starting so early and how you even start so early.
Very likely because the church will have 2, maybe 3 weddings booked for that day. If it's a Saturday, then that's the day people want to get married. So there'll be more than one wedding booked that day. And the idea being that if you have say, an 11 or 12 o'clock wedding, then you get the formalities done, the actual speeches and everything done by 2 o'clock, 2:30. Then it's all drinking time. And that's the real reason for the wedding. So...
Right, but if you're getting to a wedding, let's say it's 11 a.m. wedding, you got a 3-hour drive. That means you got to leave your house at 8. That means you're waking up at 6? 6 a.m.?
Potentially, yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah.
No thanks. 3 months later, at the London wedding of Bernard and Lydia, who became an item at the previous wedding, Charles is excited to run into Carrie. He is quickly disappointed after meeting Hamish, Carrie's fiancé. Charles experiences further humiliation from several ex-girlfriends, including the distraught Henrietta, who angrily claims Charles is a, quote, serial monogamist. He retreats to an empty hotel suite where he becomes trapped in the room while the newlyweds stumble in to have sex. Carrie returns to the reception and she and Charles have sex again.
All right. So I saw Wonka over the holiday break, and Hugh Grant's in that, and he plays an Oompa Loompa. That's my last memory of Hugh Grant, as an Oompa Loompa. And it's been a while since I've seen like OG Hugh Grant. And when I watched this, I realized, or really rather remembered, like he was hella charming, like back in his heyday. And not my type at all, but there's something about him, like he's hot, like really hot. And whether he's in like his little boxers saying fuck, fuckity, fuck, 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 like 1,000 different ways, or like he's super nervous about like having the wrong rings, or like he's really awkward around Carrie, he's just really good. And there's something about his little floppy hair, like it's very much a moment of the 90s. His glasses are incredible. I would love to own his glasses, like his eyeglasses, and his little oversized 90s suit. Like, I forgot why so many women were in love with him. And I think it's pretty obvious why he becomes such a big star. He's very, very charming.
Hold on, not your type. He's incredibly thin. He's about 6 feet tall. He's idiosyncratic and quirky, very cerebral.
So maybe he is my type.
Definitely not your type.
Well, I mean, I guess he's just like, he's also like pretty mainstream, right? Like, like he's kind of boring. So maybe that's what it is.
Are you sure what didn't turn you on were his 7-inch inseam shorts and his Adam Sandler sized button up shirt and the wool crew socks under the moccasins or whatever the fuck is it? His casual wear was abhorrent.
His casual wear was pretty terrible. I will give you that. But his everyday wear, he looks good in a tux. And there's something about like that 90s like Brit tux, like the way it's cut, looks pretty good.
Yeah, I think they did that deliberately, trying to make him look a little bit more quirky and more of an everyman, because he's there playing the toff in a suit the whole movie, so they have to try and make him a little bit relatable.
Yeah, that was a very 90s moment as well, that you could just like, oh, I'm late, let's just go into the movie now. Whatever movie happens to be playing, you don't have to reserve it. There's no reserved seats. Just go in.
No. I have decided, though, that in this part of the movie is my favorite sex scene maybe that we've ever covered. And that's saying a lot because the tequila sunrise sex scene in the hot tub is still way up there.
Yeah.
For sure. But this one's going to join it because it's not the fact that Charles is stuck under the bed while they have sex. Like, that's, fine. It's not the fact that this is the type of sex that they're having, like, at all. It's that these two very polite, kind people who just kept complete face. They didn't mock the priest who's completely screwing up their wedding vows. They're so kind, are having this ridiculous ravenous sex. And like, it's totally unabashed in a way that most people probably really have behind closed doors. And that's why it's really hard to watch. It's rough to experience, but like, it's kind of real. It's kind of incredible. And I laughed my ass off because like neither one of them clearly are very good at the sex, but they're so bad at it together that like, I guess it's good for them and it makes a lot of sense. And I thought it was pretty funny.
Yeah. Conversely, the sex scene between Charles and Carrie was terrible. Hugh Grant won't stop nervously nerding. Like he's trying to be like clever and conversational while she's just trying to get at it. And she's just making herself sound so desperate. Like these lines that she's laying on him about like, oh, what would happen if you kissed like this in a church? What about like this? If a woman were doing that to me, I'd be like, listen, I know what you're trying to do. We can just fuck.
Yeah.
We don't have to,
like
we
I'm
don't have to
sold.
do this conversation anymore. Yeah, I'm sold. Like you just here. Alternatively, just take your clothes off and we can get going. Well, a month later, Charles receives an invitation to Carrie's wedding. While shopping for her wedding gift, he runs into Carrie. They also shop for a wedding dress, and she recounts her 33 sexual partners, and Charles confesses he loves her. When Charles and his friends attend Carrie and Hamish's wedding in Scotland, the gregarious Gareth instructs the group to seek potential mates. Scarlett meets Chester, an American from Texas. As Charles watches Carrie and Hamish dance, Fiona senses his heartbreak and reveals that she loves him, but Charles does not reciprocate her feelings. During Hamish's toast, Gareth suffers a fatal heart attack. So we keep seeing these weddings. I think this is our third one at this point, 3 of 4. And in them, people seem to be reconnecting. It's the same people at every wedding, and it seems like they haven't talked to each other since the last wedding. And I'm not talking about like talking to each other like, hey, did you get a new pet? Or like, how you doing? It's like major things, major life changes. And it got me wondering, Rob, do people in England just not call one another for months on end? And I get that we now use social media to keep in touch with each other, right? It's like you can keep your tabs on all your friends, and this predates social media. We weren't all up in each other's shit back in the 90s, but people in 4 weddings seem to only communicate at these weddings. And this is like engagements, marriages, breakups, mental breakdowns. It seems to be a surprise every time they get together.
Yeah, it kind of certainly was then, because the other thing to bear in mind is it's before cell phones. Really, cell phones didn't really hit major use until about 95, 96.
Okay.
So back then you really were only keeping in close contact with very select people, like via your landlines. Yeah. Other than that, it would have been like letter. You would have got an invitation through the post for a wedding.
I think there's this tiered thing, at least in my life, that exists where like there are people that I see and keep up with, and then there are people that I see at big life events, and that's it. And so for me, there's like these demarcations where I do only see certain individuals, like, and I'll see their updates on Insta or whatever, but like actually talking to them, I only talk to when there's deaths or weddings, and that's it. And I think this movie does capture that. Now, I think that obviously we're able to at least know more of what's going on in people's lives because of social media. So like you feel maybe like you've talked to them, but really objectively, like I don't. And I see them at the weddings, I see them at the funerals, and we check in, we're good, and and I send a Christmas card, there it is. Like, that's our contact.
I mean, I guess I remember a time, I was thinking about this the other day. I remember a time, 2007. Now granted, we had cell phones at the time, but I'm living in Chicago. We don't have Facebook, or at least we weren't on it. And yet somehow I knew what was going on with people. Like you talk to a person who had news about another person, the old grapevine, right, came into effect. And it really made me nostalgic for the times when I was able to focus just on what was relevant to me. and my group of friends. And the other thing we see in this movie is that group of friends, that clique, as you mentioned, Ash. It made me miss them a lot, this group that I had. And few things in life are as beautiful as the clique you have just after college. And I hope that everybody out there had this opportunity. I remember exactly how it happened. I flew to Chicago for my friend Victoria's wedding in 2007. And I met this group of people at the wedding, and I knew I just found my people. And I left California. I moved to Chicago, and I became part of this thing we called Hot Voltron, because we like all formed one hot body out of all of our other bodies. And we did everything together. We went to dance parties, our holidays, sex, drugs, sleepovers, road trips. Everything was together. We didn't have like long-term relationships. We just had each other. And some friends, like in Four Weddings and a Funeral, were secretly in love with others. And those friends always had their eyes on someone else. And I felt like in this group, everyone was clever and beautiful and trustworthy and poetic. And it's no surprise that we would occasionally date people like we see people doing in this film. But we always came back to the fold because no one we met was as great as the friends we had. And we just looked out for one another with honest feedback about those people that we were trying to date. And eventually, you know, these things fall apart, just like we see in this film. People move away or marry or have kids, and these things don't last forever. But so much of that feeling came back in this movie, especially when Charles's clique hit Carrie's wedding, and you saw them all kind of dispersed, like they were a unit. They were like the most like thieves, hitting this bank vault of people. It was amazing.
Yeah, and I think the movie agrees with you that it doesn't last. I think the ending montage at the end where everybody's, gotten married, you don't see their friends in the wedding photos. You don't see any of that. And I think it's a way of notating that everybody eventually makes their own life. You see one another infrequently, but it's this really beautiful stage, as you mentioned, where they're your chosen family. And it's incredibly special. And at least for me, when I get back with those people, it's like absolutely no time has passed every time that I'm with them. And it's like I feel my youngest and I feel the most like myself when I'm with them. And then I go away and I live the life that I've created for myself and then eventually, hopefully, see them again at some point.
Yeah, it's inevitable that those groups will start to break up once people do couple up. I mean, the sad one at the end of the film for me was Tom and Deirdre. It looked like literally nobody showed up to their wedding. Whether that's not even his sister. I mean, whether that's because he didn't invite them or because just nobody showed up because nobody wanted to go or could go, in inverted commas. But that one looked a little bit sad. Just them and the dog.
I was relieved. I thought he married the dog at first because you see the dog. I'm like, oh my God, he just married the dog, which wasn't the case. And Rob, I took that as just an opportunity to show off the house, which I wanted to see. So it was like, okay, cool. There's the house. Awesome. At Gareth's funeral, Matthew recites a poem by W.H. Auden. Afterward, Charles and Tom ponder that despite their clique's pride in being single, Gareth and Matthew were as a married couple. They wonder whether the search for one true love is futile. 10 months later, Charles's own wedding day arrives, and his bride is Henrietta. Carrie arrives and tells Charles that she and Hamish have separated following a difficult marriage. During the ceremony, the vicar asks if anyone present has any reason why the couple should not marry. David interrupts to say the groom has doubts and loves someone else. Charles confirms this, and Henrietta angrily knocks him out.
One of the things that makes this movie completely different than other comedies like it is this huge emotional hit that you get when Gareth dies. Up until this point, we get a very typical comedy. It's very funny. It's clipping along at a great pace. And then all of a sudden, you have the death of Gareth. And so this very silly movie that's amusing, we get hit with the impact of a real death. And from the title, at least for me, the first time I saw it, and I think for a lot of people, they assume the death is going to be funny too, right? Like 4 weddings that are funny and a funeral that's funny. But it's not. It's just really, really sad. Gareth is so full of life and suddenly he's gone. And the way they deal with it is also really true to life, especially for gay men during this time period. Obviously, gay marriage was not legal at the time. We're in the height of the AIDS crisis. Gays in films were still like barely a thing. And if they were kept so apart because it couldn't be like too gay. They had to still look like, good roommates that lived together. But instead, while they're not physically affectionate, you get to see real love here. We see Matthew grieve. We see a funeral held in a tiny church in a very industrial part of town because he's gay. It's not ornate. like the weddings. It's not these big, beautiful churches. It's hidden in a way, which is where a lot of these individuals did have to be buried. And I read an article in prep for this where the director was talking about how a lot of his friends were in the audience that were gay, and a lot of them died of AIDS after the filming of this movie. And so it was very true to life in that way as well. And so much of it just hits you in the gut. And then you add to that the performance of the Alden poem, which is such a beautiful poem. I was really misty, even upon seeing it like the 100th time. I think this scene hits home so well. It is not cliche in any way. And this is the moment that you realize that this is more than just a basic comedy, that this is actually a really, really fantastic movie.
Yeah, it's not an overstatement to say that this particular scene played a really big part in normalizing gay and lesbian relationships in the UK at the time. And it really did help pave the way for civil partnerships and eventually gay marriage, which came in the following decades. In reality, Matthew and Gareth were a closeted couple. Matthew actually uses the Auden poem to come out at Gareth's funeral to his friends and family. And it really resonated with the British public who saw the film, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. It made people stop and think about their own friend groups. It actually gave courage for a lot of people to come out to theirs because they'd seen this friend group who were really supportive and just sad. This man had to die for them to know that they had this great love within them, within their group, and they didn't even know about it, and they couldn't have known about it, and they were just sad that it would could never continue.
I think one thing that we should orient here, since we are a movie podcast, is that the year prior to this in America, Philadelphia came out, right? And for a lot of mainstream audiences, my parents included, my parents had never gone to a movie that was about two gay men and then cried when one of those gay men died, right? Spoiler alert, Tom Hanks dies in it. Sorry if I ruined that. But it was a big moment for American audiences that found something relatable in that performance. And I remember this being the same way. And I'll be honest, Rob, I didn't get that they were closeted and him coming out, because if you watch the nuances of Gareth's dad, and the way he orients himself around Matthew and the way he glares at him, and when Matthew gets them in the car, and then even at the funeral, there was this thing that happened in the 90s where so many parents were not allowed to grieve their children because it was considered to be a thing that you had to hide that your child was gay. And so therefore there were and there's so many essays that have been written where they felt like they couldn't even grieve the fact that their kids had died. And I get that so much from this funeral scene where the mom is so emotional, and the dad, you can see whoever that actor is, that nameless actor, he does such a great job of showing that like he's so pained that he's dead, but he's angry and he won't express it because his son wasn't what he wanted him to be, right? Like there's so much depth in that scene that's really, really beautifully done.
Yeah, it's interesting because, the cue there that we got, that I picked up on, was when they referred to Matthew as his friend, right? His close friend, which with older gays that I know, it's still a thing where they will refer to like, this is her friend, Ruth. Like we all know what her friend means, but and you accept it. It's none of my business, but we know. And I love that they took it from this typical funeral process into something a little bit dirtier, a little bit more flawed, a little bit cracked. And I hope that someone does that for me when I pass away. Expose those, shortcomings that I had, right? The issues that everyone knew about me, but maybe nobody was going to say right in front of me. I don't want to hear a sanitized generic catalog of accomplishments. That's what you normally get at weddings, and it drives me nuts, right? They were such a good person. They did so much charity work. They earned these degrees, and they advanced in their company. And of course, your friends and family all loved you, right? That's what you hear at every funeral. Skip all that. We don't need that, right? I wish that at funerals, or at least at mine, that you get to know how it felt to be with that person, and what made that person cry, and what drove that person crazy. What were their weird, bad habits, that made them or that were the hallmarks of that individual. That's what a funeral should be about, not accolades and accomplishments.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of the most important things you can do is pick who gives your eulogy, right, at your wedding. When my grandmother passed away, the fact that she chose me to give her eulogy was like probably the most pressure I've ever felt in my entire life. And I'll be doing the same thing for my dad. I mean, my worst nightmare is for someone to play a hymn and then to read, some gross poem that means nothing about my life.
I thought you were going to bring up Psalm 23.
Oh,
Just
God,
retire it.
no.
Retire it, people.
Retire it. Yea, though I walk, we've all walked, right? And at that point, you're dead. Like, I passed through the valley of death at that point. But, give me Wuthering Heights, give me pass through water and alter the color of my mind type shit. I don't want banal.
Well, a few hours later, Carrie arrives at Charles's flat and apologizes for causing the fiasco. Charles again says he loves her and proposes a lifelong commitment without marriage, which Carrie accepts. In an ending photo montage, Henrietta has married an officer in the Grenadier Guards. David married Serena, whom he met at the second wedding. Scarlett has married Chester the Texan. Tom married his distant cousin Deirdre. Matthew has found a new partner. Fiona is shown with Prince Charles. And Charles and Carrie have had their first child.
Yeah, and that then brings us to that fucking song. In the UK, the other thing that Four Weddings is known for is the Wet, Wet, Wet cover of the Troggs' Love Is All Around. Was number one for 15 weeks, just short of 4 months. So that's longer than Bryan Adams and Everything I Do. And it just never disappeared for the whole of 1994. The Wet, Wet, Wet were my mum's favourite band, made it even worse. I really had to divorce myself from the song and the film to not penalise it a wipe because of the song. But even now, it just really, really irritates me because it's unimaginative, badly produced, and is the worst Marty Pellow, who's actually a decent singer, has ever sung. But it really sums up how bad Britain was musically at the time. And it's why Britpop bands like Oasis, who were just starting to appear, were so sorely needed.
Rob, it just brings me back to Love Actually. Bill Nighy doing Christmases all around. Like, these movies are connected. I don't believe it's just a coincidence. And you talk about that fucking song. I want to talk about that fucking ending. The whole time we're watching this movie, I thought that they were building a case against Carrie. Like, we're supposed to start hating her for how awful she is. She's like Glenn Guglia in The Wedding Singer, right? She cheats on her fiance. She gleefully lists and rates all 33 dudes she's fucked while she's talking to this simp who helped her shop for her wedding dress to marry another guy and clearly loves her. And then she still marries Hamish right in front of Charles, breaking his heart. Then she shows up at Charles's wedding and has the audacity to say, "Oh, well, like, my marriage wasn't working out, so hey, I just happen to be here. I'll go right over here, right out of the way, right? But just hi." She is an absolute asshole, and I know that it's convenient to go full 80s movie here and have Charles fall in love with the clearly superior Fiona. Like that's what's supposed to happen, right? Fifi's the great friend, and she's beautiful, and she's so stylish, and she's just hot. And he's going to look to his right and recognize, oh my God, she's the one I was supposed to be with all along. They didn't do that. And I applaud them for not doing that, but it would have been better than the ending that we got.
Yeah, I can see that. Also, that she married Hamish and indirectly caused Gareth's death. That would kind of annoy me as well. If she doesn't marry Hamish, then Gareth doesn't die then. It's...
She kills your friend.
Or maybe like they don't wind up with anyone.
Yeah.
Like, that's a crazy idea. And I knew that you were going to hit on this because it's the glaring issue with the film. Like, sure, Carrie, I mean, I think other than her gums, she's pretty. Charles likes her, but in love, like, there's no way. There's no reason to believe he has any connection to her beyond sex. And although I will say this about it, as much as I don't like it, I like that they don't get married and they just have like a baby at the end, because that was very, not on brand for 1994.
Yeah.
So I did like that piece. But I also remember, though, my dad watching this, and we were talking about it afterwards, and my mom was like, well, can you believe they didn't get married? And my dad was like, oh, no, I think they were just taking a picture of somebody else's baby. So I think it was lost on some American audiences what they were trying to do with that. But the ending sucked.
They just found some baby.
Right.
And that's the photo they decided to share.
Picture. Right. The one picture they show is the one that's in your picture frame before you remove it to put the picture of your real family in there. That's about how authentic as the end of this movie is.
Well, now is the time in the podcast where we give our Shat score for Four Weddings and a Funeral. The Shat score is our way of telling you how many wipes this movie takes to get off your respective butts. 0 wipes is a perfect movie. It is waistcoats, waistcoats, waistcoats. And 5 wipes is an absolute disaster movie. It's when you're the hearing impaired guy in your clique and nobody but your brother bothers to learn sign language. Rob, we'll start with you. What is your wipe score for Four Weddings and a Funeral?
It's still got the best parts of a Richard Curtis film. Sharp but witty observation of British life, belly laughs and tragedy. It shows its age in some parts now, but at the same time, it's a time capsule, like no mobile phones. Rowan Atkinson now seems very forced as a cameo rather than funny, but overall it's top tier Britcom. It launched some major careers, and I'm not going to dock any wipes for the song, tempting though it is. So I'm going to go 1.25 wipes.
I'm going to come in right with you there, Rob, with 1.25 as well. I love this movie. It's funny. It moves nicely. It's full of great acting. I think it's a lot better than average. Is it perfect? No. I do think it drags a little in places. Maybe it could have been like 3 weddings and a funeral instead of 4. But I also hate that they're all matched in the end, as that's not life. It's the same problem I have with, Sex and the City and what they did with that show. And I do think that Carrie's a bit wooden as a character, but overall, I think it's great. It's an example of a really awesome Brit comedy that has staying power. It gave us the gift of Hugh Grant. It's 1.25.
All right, I'm going to round this out and make it unanimous at 1.25 wipes. I'm so glad, Rob, that you brought up Richard Curtis, because that feeling really came through for me. It felt familiar. It felt like something I really enjoy. And then when you brought that up, I said, oh, shit, yes, this is a Richard Curtis movie through and through. I laughed out loud several times. And what I didn't like about the movie was just personal. And I'll admit that, right? I think Andie MacDowell doesn't deserve Hugh Grant. I think that Carrie sucked as a character. I think that some of the speeches were beautiful, but a little too perfect. But despite all of that, I felt a lot watching this movie. I thought a lot. I smiled a lot. I nearly even cried at the funeral. That means something in a comedy that has mass market appeal, that's making over $200 million in the box office, right? So this is an excellent film. It's going to give us a unanimous score of 1.25 wipes. That ties it at the 78th spot in the pantheon of Shat, with only one movie, The Road Warrior. It is.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It is oddly.
That's bizarre.
According to Shat, this movie is better than RoboCop and just slightly worse than Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
Yeah, I feel like that's right. I mean, RoboCop is more fun maybe than this movie, but better. This movie's better than RoboCop. RoboCop is fun, though.
Ash, what do we have coming up next week?
So next week, we are taking a complete turn in an opposite direction from a Brit rom-com, and we are heading into the world of fantasy. In this movie, a young man must stop the Lord of Darkness from destroying daylight and marrying the woman he loves. Coming out in 1985, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Tom Cruise. Excited. I've not seen this one. Like all fantasy films from the 80s, this is one I have not seen.
This is one that I kept getting mixed up with Labyrinth, so I haven't seen it either. But this commission does come from Carlos and Natasha, the Male People, and it'll kick off a 3-week span of Carlos and Natasha movies, which they were kind enough to let us pick.
I do love a 1980s Tom Cruise before he got into the Scientology, so that's exciting.
Mm-hmm. I saw a Scientology ad on the television the other day. Really? Like a full-on Scientology.
Was it for the cans that you hold?
Yeah. And like their website and everything. They actually showed like the Phaeton reader or whatever on TV. I thought they were more secretive
if you go
than
clear, If you go clear, I'm not going to respect you anymore. I can't. I like unclear, Gene.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe, for your commission. Thank you, Carlos and Natasha, for your upcoming commission. Thank you to all the commissioners who make this podcast possible. That concludes this week's episode of Shat the Movies. Sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat the Movies. Email us, host@shatpod.com. Support the podcast by shopping our Amazon affiliate link, buying our merch, or by commissioning your own movie. Find all information by visiting our website, shatpod.com. Also, check out our sister podcast, Shat on TV, where we review TV series such as Lovecraft Country, Westworld, True Detective, Taboo, American Gods, Game of Thrones, and Watchmen. Find all information on our website, shatpod.com/TV, wherever fine podcasts can be found, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe, and if you stop by Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review. Let us know how much you love Rob. Help the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash and Rob, I'm Gene Lyons. Join us next week for the following movie.
There is a balance to the universe. The struggle to maintain that balance is the stuff of legends. For there can be no good without evil, no love without hate. Life needs death. Innocence feeds lust. There can be no heaven without hell, no light without me.